trust in the Lord. Cut away, make your heart restore. Heavy load we carry long, but His light go make us strong. No more running, no disguise. Circumcise your heart, arise. No be strength, no be might. Now His hand they show the light. Step by step we hold on tight. Faith go guide us through the night. No wahala we go there. No fear, no shaker. Faith go guide us through the night. Your time is santan. Bine to back over the night. Bine to get baby vision. Tap to me please rent. No more money, no vision. Keep on a cocaine and qua. No more manji de dila. Keep show near the man. My bedroom. Oh, Vibekele. No fear, no doubt. Trust in the Lord. Cut away, make your heart restore. Heavy load we carry long, but His light go make us strong. No more running, no disguise. Circumcise your heart, arise. No be strength, no be might. Now His hand they show the light. Step by step we hold on tight. Faith go guide us through the night. No wahala we go there. No fear, no shake.
When most people imagine the founding of the United States, they picture liberty, hard work, and a blank canvas. But the land wasn't blank. It was already inhabited, cultivated, and defended by indigenous nations who had lived here for thousands of years. These were not scattered tribes, but organized nations with governance, diplomacy, and territorial control. European colonization began by ignoring these facts. The British Crown issued land charters and patents as if the continent were uninhabited, drawing lines through native homelands and handing them over to settlers, companies, and elites. This wasn't settlement, it was theft, legalized by paperwork and backed by violence. As the English, French, Spanish, and Dutch jockeyed for position, native nations resisted. Wars broke out, treaties were signed and broken, but indigenous people were steadily pushed westward through forced removal, military conquest, and land speculation schemes. Colonial governments saw land as the basis for wealth, power, and social order. From the beginning, this land was distributed not based on merit or fairness, but on proximity to power. The people who would become the first American elite did not discover America. They were handed pieces of it by a king who didn't own it, and they defended it with policies and weapons that prioritized their wealth over native lives. The colonial story begins not with freedom, but with seizure. And from that seizure, the American landed class was born. While the Crown gave away land, it did not do so at a loss. The British Empire profited politically, strategically, and economically by distributing land to loyal officers, investors, and elite families. The Crown expanded its territorial claims without having to finance large settler operations directly. These landowners acted as imperial agents, bringing British law, religion, and commercial interest into contested areas. Military officers were rewarded with land grants instead of cash, saving the Crown money while cultivating a loyal colonial leadership. These men upheld British authority and served as buffers against rival powers and indigenous resistance. As settlements grew, the land itself became productive, generating exports like tobacco and timber that fueled British industry. Colonists were taxed on trade, and customs duties enriched imperial coffers. In this way, the land grants were an investment in imperial infrastructure. Though not always immediately profitable, they laid the foundation for long-term colonial wealth that benefited the empire through loyalty, expansion, and economic integration. But how did the British Crown come to believe it had the authority to claim these lands in the first place? The answer lies in a blend of religious justification, imperial ambition, and symbolic acts of possession. Based on the Doctrine of Discovery, a legal and religious principle rooted in papal bulls of the 15th century, European Christian monarchies claimed the right to seize non-Christian lands. Indigenous nations, regardless of their sovereignty or civilization, were seen as subjects to be converted, subdued, or ignored. English claims to North America began with explorers like John Cabot, who, in 1497, sailing under commission from King Henry VII, landed in Newfoundland and claimed the territory for England. This act of symbolic possession, planting a flag, making a declaration, set the precedent. Over the following century, English monarchs issued land charters to private companies and favored individuals, treating foreign territory as royal property to be parceled out at will. These acts were backed by military force, colonial militias, and settlement policies that erased native land claims. King James I, 1603 to 1625. The first giveaway. King James I was the first English monarch to grant land in America. In 1606, he issued the Virginia Charter to the Virginia companies. From the swamps of Jamestown grew dynasties that would rule Virginia and the South for generations. The Byrds, the Carters, the Lees, the Randolphs, families whose names became synonymous with land, wealth, and power, built on the backs of enslaved labor and stolen land. King Charles I, 1625 to 1649. Expansion for the elite. King Charles I expanded land giveaways. In 1632, he granted Maryland to Lord Baltimore, a proprietary colony. Land became a tool to reward nobles and build personal empires. Colonial elites didn't discover America. They inherited pieces of it through royal favors. Still, on the ground, settlers faced indigenous resistance at every step. King Charles II, 1660 to 1685, the biggest giveaway. After the monarchy was restored after the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, Charles II rewarded loyalty with land on a massive scale. In 1663, he gave the Carolinas to 8 noble supporters. In 1664, he seized New Netherland, renamed it New York, and gave it to his brother. In 1681, he gave Pennsylvania to William Penn to settle royal debt. In total, Charles II handed out hundreds of millions of acres. But ownership on paper didn't stop native resistance. Conquest, war, and removal were necessary to make the grants real. King James II, 1685 to 1688. James II focused less on new grants and more on tightening royal control. He tried to consolidate colonies under the dominion of New England. His reign ended quickly with the Glorious Revolution. Settlers kept expanding on land already stolen or promised. The wars never stopped. William III and Mary II, 1689 to 1702. Control over colonies. No major new land grants. They shifted their focus to trade control and taxation. Colonial society hardened into a structure where land ownership meant whiteness and power. Slavery was expanding, and colonies were starting to become extremely profitable. Queen Anne, 1702 to 1714. She focused on European wars rather than American expansion. Colonies continued to spread westward, often without direct royal permission. The hunger for land and the violence that came with it had become a self-sustaining machine. King George I, 1714 to 1727, little new growth, oversaw the colonies passively. No major new land grants, but colonial populations swelled and indigenous displacement continued. King George II, 1727 to 1760, the last king to grant land. In 1732, he approved the creation of Georgia, the final of the 13 original colonies. Land was given to James Oglethorpe and trustees, a buffer against Spanish Florida. After Georgia, no major land grants were made. The crown shifted toward taxing and controlling what it already claimed. The American landed class didn't build their wealth from the ground up. They inherited it through royal favor and family connections. The British Crown distributed millions of acres of native land to favored subjects, often in the form of massive land grants. These grants were given to loyal military officers, wealthy investors, and politically connected families who had ties to the monarchy. The recipients didn't have to pay for the land. It was a gift of imperial patronage. Much of this land was allocated through outright nepotism. Colonial elites passed property to sons, brothers, and sons-in-law, consolidating land holdings within extended dynasties. Political appointments and marriages became tools for expanding land empires. These networks ensured that land ownership and the power it brought remained confined to a narrow group of white families with elite status. George Washington is a prime example. While he gained some land through his work as a surveyor, a person who measured and mapped land boundaries, to determine property lines and assign ownership, the vast majority of his wealth came through inheritance from his family and marriage. Surveying became a powerful tool in this era. Men like George Washington rose by learning to map and measure the stolen land. Surveyors didn't just mark borders, they spotted the best land first, claimed it, and flipped it for enormous profit. It was a way for young men from landholding or ambitious families to enter land speculation, politics, and wealth. Surveying opened the door to land speculation, political influence, and wealth. It wasn't just a job, it was a ticket into the colonial elite. Washington's older half-brother Lawrence Washington had powerful connections with the likes of the Fairfax family, who helped George get appointed. Washington inherited land from his father, Augustine Washington, a prominent planter who owned thousands of acres. Augustine acquired much of this land through royal grants, speculative purchases, and connections with Virginia's elite planter class. As a justice of the peace and trusted figure in colonial society, Augustine had access to some of the most coveted land available. Upon his father's death, George received significant holdings and later expanded his estate further by marrying Martha Custis, a wealthy widow who brought even more land and enslaved laborers into the Union. Washington also received land grants for his military service and continued to grow his holdings through surveys, purchases, and speculation. He rented land to tenants, sold parcels for profit, and relied heavily on enslaved labor to farm his estates. Thomas Jefferson's rise followed a similar path. Born into the powerful Randolph family, one of Virginia's most influential dynasties, he inherited over 5,000 acres. The Randolphs received their land through royal grants, speculative acquisitions, and early political connections that dated back to the formative years of the Virginia colony. The family's influence stretched across multiple branches, ensuring that land and status remained in elite hands. Jefferson used enslaved labor to build Monticello and manage his plantations, and he expanded his wealth through speculation and land purchases. These men were not unique. Across the colonies, especially in the South, a relatively small group of elite families amassed enormous landholdings through inheritance, royal patronage, and political favoritism. Families like the Washingtons, Randolphs, Lees, and Carters controlled tens of thousands of acres and shaped colonial politics, law, and trade. Within these dynasties, land and power were distributed among siblings and extended family, reinforcing class dominance. The landed aristocracy used legal tools like primogeniture, passing land to the eldest son, to prevent estates from being divided. Younger sons were often provided with land from other family branches or married into land-rich families. These strategies preserved wealth across generations. In the North, the dynamic was somewhat different. Large estates existed, especially in parts of New York and Pennsylvania, but the society was generally more commercially oriented and less dominated by a rigid aristocracy. Land was more often distributed in smaller plots to individual families or townships, and religious groups like the Quakers emphasized flatter hierarchies. Still, property ownership remained a requirement for voting and office holding, and northern elites often controlled banking, shipping, and legal systems. Compared to the North, the southern landed class was larger in scale and more deeply tied to slavery. These elites rented land to tenants, leased it to overseers, and profited from its sale. Land was not just a resource, it was a financial asset, a social position, and a tool of political power. Their vast estates functioned as self-contained economies, powered by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. These men became America's political leaders because they were already its economic elite. Their control of land ensured they controlled lawmaking, military defense, and colonial expansion. Population growth in the early colonies primarily reflected the influx of white settlers and the forced migration of enslaved Africans. By 1650, the total colonial population was approximately 50,000, consisting largely of white settlers and a growing but still relatively small number of enslaved Africans. As the colonies expanded, demographic trends increasingly diverged by race, with enslaved Africans comprising a larger share of the southern population by the early 1700s. The colonial elite didn't rise by accident. They rose because land was granted to them and labor was provided for them. Before America was a nation, it was already a hierarchy built on land, race, and law. In the early 1600s, most of the labor in the colonies was done by indentured servants, poor Europeans who agreed to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for a chance at freedom. Most indentured servants were poor whites, criminals, and debtors, people too desperate to survive in Europe. They sold years of their lives to work off the cost of their passage to America. They dreamed that after their service, they could move to the frontier, claim their own piece of land, and build a life. But freedom was never easy. Mortality rates were brutally high. In the early colonies, half or more of indentured servants died before completing their contracts. Not from violence or starvation, but mostly from disease, from poor hygiene, sanitary practices, malaria, dysentery, typhoid fever, and smallpox that swept through overcrowded settlements, killing thousands before they ever saw freedom. And even those who survived were often pushed onto the roughest lands at the edges of the colonies, onto native territories, sparking constant warfare as the frontier expanded westward. In 1675, indentured servants still outnumbered enslaved Africans across the colonies, but the system was reaching a breaking point. In 1676, the fragile social order cracked. Bacon's Rebellion erupted in Virginia, a revolt led by poor whites and enslaved Africans united against the wealthy planter class. For a moment, class, not race, united the oppressed, and it terrified the elite. They realized that the unification of poor whites and black laborers was the biggest threat to their position of power. If poor whites and black workers remained united, the entire plantation system could collapse. In response to Bacon's rebellion, the plantation class acted quickly and decisively. They made deliberate efforts to shift away from indentured servants and toward permanent black slavery. They passed new laws. Slavery became lifelong and hereditary, binding black people and their children into bondage forever. Children inherited the status of their mother, guaranteeing an ever-growing enslaved labor force. Interracial marriage was outlawed to prevent alliances between poor whites and Africans. White indentured servants were promised land, guns, and legal rights, buying their loyalty and driving a wedge between the races. The Southern elite built their power not on the backs of poor whites, but on royal land grants and the stolen labor of enslaved Africans. Poor whites were given a different role, not to build wealth but to protect it, securing their power by dividing those beneath them. A racial caste system replaced temporary class alliances. Freedom became a reward for whiteness. Bondage became the permanent fate of blackness. Over the next 50 years, the transformation was unmistakable. By the 1680s, the number of indentured servants and enslaved Africans across the colonies was roughly equal, with about 10,000 to 15,000 each. By 1750, the number of indentured servants had dropped to fewer than 5,000, while the enslaved population had grown to over 200,000. By 1776, indentured servitude had almost disappeared, and nearly 500,000 black people were enslaved across the 13 colonies. Slavery wasn't just part of the economy. Now it was the economy. By the time of the American Revolution, the foundation was laid. The colonial elite had positioned themselves to seize control of the colonies, to challenge the monarchy, and to build a new nation on their terms. They controlled the land, they controlled the laws, and they had built a profitable economy, poised for rapid growth, fueled by perpetual black labor. They also crafted a social order that would serve their ambitions. A rising poor white class promised land and opportunity, pushing westward to seize native territories. They were turned into slave patrols, militias, overseers, and later sheriffs and police. Their job was to protect the wealth and power of the Southern elite. They didn't get the land, they didn't get the riches. They got just enough status and a role in policing black labor to stay loyal to the system that kept them poor too. Even as poor whites labored without land or wealth, they were given one thing to hold on to: the idea that no matter how bad their lives were, at least they weren't black. It was a lie, but a powerful one. A lie that would divide America for centuries and secured the racial hierarchy that kept black people in permanent bondage. The wealth, the freedom, and the power that would define America were rooted not just in ideals, but in a system designed to divide, conquer, and extract. a system where liberty was reserved for the few, and where expansion, wealth, and control were built on stolen lives and stolen lands. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.